All right, we are now moving on into chapter 4 of my autobiography. This is Partings and Awakenings. Now, at just about the same time as my relationship with my first girlfriend was ending, my aunt died. This is the aunt who had given me unconditional love. Her health had been bad for a long time. She was obese and suffered complications from multiple surgeries in which her hip had to be replaced with a metal one. I went to see her in the hospital. She couldn't talk. She just wanted to hold my hand because she knew it would be for the last time. It was very upsetting to me. She was the first close relative of mine ever to die, and dealing with the grief from it was not easy. However, she did leave us a bit of money, not a lot, but a little. My mom took charge of it, as my brother and I were still minors, and we decided, all three of us, to go visit New York City the summer after I had graduated from high school. New York was absolutely amazing. Phoenix is huge too, but it is an expansive horizontal city of massive urban sprawl, whereas New York is a compressive and vertical city with tremendous energy that just bears down on you as you walk the streets. I was dazzled by all the skyscrapers. The skyline at night reminded me of the city in Blade Runner, and the immense energy of all the various ethnicities was something I had never experienced before. This is an AI image of New York, kind of a fantasial, dreamlike version of it. When we returned to Phoenix, where my mother was still living with her mother, I decided to take my car and head back across town to visit my high school friends. It was an incredibly hot July afternoon, probably in the 110s, and I traversed the enormous freeway system for the 45 minutes that it took to get back to North Phoenix. With the air conditioning running full blast, I pulled up to the apartment where my friends were now living together and went inside. One of my high school friends, his name was Chuck, and he wore glasses and looked sort of like a dog with a crazy shoulder-length hair splayed out in all directions, went past me to take out the trash, but then came right back inside and said, "Hey, John, do you know your car is on fire?" I did not. So I went outside to take a look, and there on the hood of my car, a hole was forming as smoke from the fire under the hood gathered with magmatic force. We called the fire department right away, and they came and put out the fire, but now I had no transportation. I was stranded for the time being at my friend's apartment. These were two high school friends who were now roommates, Chuck and the maestro, aka Scott Hussey, and were also living with Chuck's older brother, a hardcore member of a biker gang. His name was Larry, and he always wore a leather jacket with his gang's logo on the back. This was an individual you did not cross. People who had fucked with him were known to have disappeared. I got along just fine with him, though. He always treated me very respectfully, and I appreciated that. So I decided to live with my friends for a while. I slept on the couch and spent the afternoons while they were away working their jobs. They all worked for the same warehouse selling automobile parts, lazing around by the pool, flirting with girls, and smoking pot. But the problem was that my friends had now moved on to harder drugs. They were smoking crack cocaine now, which I absolutely refused to do. I would sit with them in a circle as they passed the glass pipe around, always offering it to me with gentle pressure to at least try it one time, but I adamantly refused. That was a line I was not going to cross because I knew exactly where it would lead, and I wasn't about to throw my life away at that point. I was going to be a great writer, not a crack addict, so I refused. And then, predictably, they all started suffering from various psychoses. Larry was always picking up little bits of shag carpet, claiming that it was infested with bugs. Andy started behaving in strange, erratic ways, becoming very unpredictable. You never knew what mood you were going to find him in next. They sold off all the furniture bit by bit, first the stereo, then the couch, and that left me sleeping on the living room floor without even so much as a pillow. Even though they had jobs which they went to every day, they still needed more money to support their crack habit. It was becoming a bad scene, and I knew it was going to be time to get out of there soon. The call to get out came when Larry burst through the front door one night as we were all sitting around dinner getting stoned. He pointed his finger straight at me and said, "John, you were never here tonight. Chuck, you were never here tonight," and so forth, until we were all implicated. I knew enough not to ask any questions as Larry was in a frantic state. We simply got up and walked out the door and got into my friend's car, and as we were rounding the corner, I saw Larry's motorcycle lying in the middle of the street in pieces. I have no idea what happened, but in any event, Larry had left the scene of an accident, and I knew that was bad news. That was the end of my relationship to my childhood friends. I went back to live with my mother, who had moved into a new house that her mother had helped her to rent, located just around the corner from her in Mesa. But later I heard a few things through the grapevine about those friends. As it turns out, Chuck and Larry's parents, unbeknownst to me, were actually making counterfeit money. And it was working because they were buying stuff with it. I remember their parents vividly. The mother was short, fat, and chatty. very extroverted and always asking about our comfort. What did we need? Cookies, soda, a sandwich? Are we doing okay? And the clean-shaven father was always buried in a newspaper that he had spread open in front of him and never said a word. But sometimes he would slide the newspaper aside and give you a wink of acknowledgement, as though we were all involved in some kind of family conspiracy. Very nice guy, but they were counterfeiting money. Apparently what happened was that the maestro one day got busted for something or other, probably buying drugs, and the FBI, who knew about the counterfeiting, made a deal with him. They put a wire on him, and he helped to get Chuck's parents arrested. Later, the maestro told me over the phone that last he heard, Larry was looking for him with a gun. As far as I know, however, the maestro is still alive, as I've seen his page on Facebook. Now came the time to sign up for college. I wasn't sure whether I wanted to go or not. I went down to the registrar at Arizona State University to sign up for classes, and I became totally overwhelmed. I got on the phone to Mom and told her I didn't want to do it and that I didn't want to go to college. I didn't think I would need it. All I wanted to do was become a writer of best-selling fiction. What did I need college for? Get your ass over to the registrar right now, she said, and sign up for those classes. You're going to do it because I never got the chance to do it, so you're going to. And she hung up on me. So I signed up for classes. I spent the first year of college in a dorm in one of those skyscraper dorms that you see surrounding ASU. I had a roommate with whom I got along well, though we shared few common interests, and all we did that first year was drink and go to parties every night. Somewhere on one of those floors there was always a party going on, so I was constantly drunk and totally uninterested in my classes, until two things that happened to awaken me. The first was making a new friend in an English lit class who could write fiction as well as I could. This was a first. I had never encountered anyone that I thought was as good at writing fiction as I was, and this individual, whose name was Sid Quashie, who read his short story to the classroom, clearly could. He was an African-American who had grown up in Scottsdale, but he was a descendant, only one generation removed, of the Ashanti tribe in Ghana, West Africa. He was always flying back and forth to visit his relatives there, and he was a fluent speaker of French. He used to help me with my French classes. He was extremely bright and had read exactly the same types of books that I had read: science fiction, fantasy, and horror, although I was better read in horror fiction, and his favorite genre was fantasy, that is to say, swords and sorcery of the Tolkien variety. And once again, I'd found another fan of Stephen R. Donaldson, whose new novel had just been published that year and about which we were both very excited. The Mirror of Her Dreams. It was actually in 2 volumes. It was one huge novel that Donaldson's publisher made him cut in half because it was well over 1,000 pages. And the second volume was called A Man Rides Through. They were very good, some of his best work. Let's see. So what happened then is that the two of us got into an agonic relationship over who could write the better short story. We would go back and forth trading stories. I would write one and he would critique it, usually telling me it was trash and that I could do better. He would write one and pass it back to me, and I would be equally brutal with him, back and forth. It's important for young men to get into agonic relationships with each other in one field or another. Doesn't matter what it is. But it's the Greek ideal of strife. Competition with your peers, no matter what the woke left wants you to believe, brings great things out of you. Now, rewinding back to that first year of college, to the second thing that woke me up. I had taken a course in 20th century English poetry, and in that class we read T.S. Eliot's great poem, The Wasteland. I had never read it before, but I remembered that in Apocalypse Now, Colonel Kurtz read from T.S. Eliot's poem, The Hollow Men, and 2 of the books on Kurtz's shelf were The Golden Bough by James Fraser and From Ritual to Romance by Jessie L. Weston. I noticed that in Eliot's notes to his own poem, he prominently acknowledged those same 2 books as important influences on the poem. This was my first exposure to real, actual highbrow literature, and as I became obsessed with trying to understand Eliot's poem, the world of drugstore paperbacks and Stephen King began to fade away behind me. I knew the moment I read Eliot's poem that I was done with trashy bestsellers. I didn't want to be Stephen King anymore. I wanted to be as great as Eliot or James Joyce or William Faulkner. My friend and I both discovered highbrow literature at about the same time, and we started trading Faulkner's novels back and forth. Do you think you can write as well as this guy? My friend would ask me bluntly, and that felt like a challenge to me, so I said, I don't know. Maybe. Let's try it. So then the agon began, and we were off and running. Who could be the better writer? Who was the best writer of the 20th century? My favorite soon became James Joyce, as we read A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man in another literature class. Sid's all-time favorites were Faulkner and Dostoevsky. I began to tell him about Ulysses. and Finnegan's Wake, which I hadn't quite attempted yet, but I knew from reading the first chapter that it was very likely the apotheosis of modernist literature. With that novel, Joyce had set the bar for greatness as far as it could possibly go, and now that was my goal. I wanted to write something as great as Finnegan's Wake, and so now my stories were no longer science fiction and horror stories. I began to write works of literature with mythological themes. And then one day, as we were walking home from school, my friend told me that he was going to write a new short story about myths. Greek myths, you mean? I said, no, he said, I mean about contemporary mythic figures like James Dean and Marilyn Monroe. Then he told me that he was reading a book called The Hero with 1,000 Faces by someone named Joseph Campbell. I filed that away in my head for future reference. But then not too long after that conversation, I was channel surfing in my studio apartment one night and happened upon a series on PBS called The Power of Myth, with Bill Moyers interviewing this Joseph Campbell fellow. I remembered what my friend had said, and so, bored and looking for something to watch, I watched Campbell talking for a while, and then, slowly at first, but then more rapidly, by the second, I felt my attention gathering, focusing, and concentrating very specifically on every single word he uttered. Pretty soon I was hooked. I started watching every episode of The Power of Myth, and all at once I knew that I had to understand what this man was talking about. I didn't know why. I just knew that it was important. I wanted to know what he knew and figure out how he learned it. I then went to the library to get hold of The Hero with 1,000 Faces and the 4 volumes of The Masks of God, and started reading through them. These were the first nonfiction books I had ever read, and I was completely captivated. I burned through those, and then as I read the volumes of The Masks of God, I noticed that Campbell kept referring to this Oswald Spengler fellow constantly. I figured I better check out what that was about, so I went to the campus library and found a copy of The Decline of the West. I opened it to the charts in the back of the book that had a complete morphology of the internal anatomies of all the world's great high civilizations. Bam! I was gone. It was over. I had a new addiction now, learning. A totally new drug. Suddenly, with Spengler and Campbell, I had a map that put everything in its right place. Nothing was random anymore. Now I could see how the paintings of Rembrandt connected with the string quartets of Beethoven, and how and why and where the Renaissance happened when it did, and why it was that we were living in a decadent society that was losing touch with all its metaphysical traditions. We were not, as I had been led to believe, at the pinnacle of history, but only one more civilization at the tail end of its dying life cycle. Cultures are all mortal, every single one of them, ours included. This insight completely transformed the way I saw the world. All of this began to feed back into my fiction writing, which became better and better and more ambitious. From that point on, my grades improved and I got straight A's. I remained celibate all through college because women now seemed irrelevant to me. I wasn't interested in chasing them. I was interested in chasing books and knowledge and learning. My cognitive map was now growing at an exponential rate. I stopped drinking completely. I was totally sober for my last 3 years of college. And my friend was becoming a little dazzled and intimidated by how much learning I was taking in and how many works of nonfiction I was now reading. Both of us, throughout the remaining years of college, got better and better with our fiction precisely by competing with each other. Until finally, during the last year of college, I won first place in a short story writing contest sponsored by the ASU campus newspaper. It was called Where the Sun Bleeds, a story that I wrote based upon what I knew about my mother's childhood. I made her father a chemist instead of a rocket scientist, then later changed him into a genetic engineer as the story became the seed from out of which my later novels, Every Angel is Terrifying and Motorcycle Girl Descends into Hell, grew. I remember walking all over the campus that day, seeing kids with the newspaper open, reading my story. I felt very proud of myself and like I had finally achieved something worthwhile. My friend loved the story too and grudgingly congratulated me. I had won the Agon. Here's the story with the judge's comments. And so this is the newspaper, the State Press Magazine. The dateline says November 11th, 1989, but I believe it was actually November 3rd, 1989 when it was published. And here are the 3 places. I'll read the judge's comments here. I try when reading a story for the first time not to notice technique. I don't consciously register point of view, sentence pattern, or tense. I read for story. On a second reading, I look for why the story works. First place winner Where the Sun Bleeds works because rich description, disturbing incidents, and spooky characters create a nightmarish landscape. A chemist's daughter tells a story that evokes the shadow side of newspaper reports about chemical warfare. She witnesses the psychological and physical degeneration of her father, a man who manufactures chemical weapons in his basement. She watches her mother, a woman forbidden to enter rooms in her own house, break down. Agent Orange rots the foundation of this American household, and because they are not simple-minded, the family cannot divorce themselves from fear and guilt. The narrator witnesses a realistic nightmare, one from which neither she nor a conscious reader can awaken. All right, and there's a little bio of me here, and they made me pose in this picture. I look like a guy who's all set to go work in Silicon Valley somewhere as a computer programmer or something like that. It's kind of funny. This is one of the very few photos of me, though, from college. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and read the story. Here it is. And I know it's hard to see on here. I'm going to actually have to read it from the original newspaper, which I have here. We spent all day yesterday wrestling with this thing, trying to get a newspaper format to fit into a book format. A little bit like pounding a square peg into a round hole, but this is the best we could do. I'll go ahead and read it, though. This is where the sun bleeds, my father would tell me during the evenings when we stood watching it sink red and swollen behind the slender white trees of the orchard, where father had forbidden me ever to go. Right here, he would say, over this house, for me. And he would point as it disappeared, swallowed by the warm yellow evening like a giant orange. At the beginning of summer, before the brown trunks of the palm trees would slump beneath the white heat of the sun, and the green fan leaves become dry and brittle, we would cross the hot black asphalt from which rising heat would transform approaching cars into gray liquid ghosts, and we would steal oranges from Old Man's orchard where the trunks had been painted white to protect them from drying up too soon. When I asked father once why he forbade me to go, he said it was because the oranges were contaminated with insecticides and would poison us. We had broken the tough, ripe skins and squeezed the juice all over our bodies, but none of us ever became sick, and when I told the other kids what father had said, they merely laughed. Our bodies would dry, all sticky in the sun, and orange rinds would gather like white clay beneath our fingernails, and we would set up sprinklers on the stiff, dry lawns browned by the sun's heat, and then run through pencil-thin streams of water until we dried, loose grass sticking to our feet. The smell of the oranges, bright and sweet, would remain on our hands for days, no matter how thoroughly we washed them. Mother would occasionally lie in a chair in the front yard, her skin smooth and white as ivory, and no matter how often she lay out, her body glistening with oily sweat and lotion, her skin would remain the same pure white it had always been, untouched by the sun. She would often set a jar of dark gold tea out, and sometimes I would twirl my baton near it so that she would notice me, but it rarely worked. I asked her once why one of the palm trees had begun to sag, why its leaves had become dull, flat stems, unmoved by the infrequent gusts of hot wind, and she said that it was because the sun was too strong sometimes and it wasn't getting enough water. Once the heat had settled in for good, however, I stayed inside the house most of the time and drank lemonade and watched television while the rattling cooler blew a steady current of moist air through the silent house, and I would sit and listen to it, letting it flow over me, causing my clothes to stick to my skin. When I would take the milk from the refrigerator, the carton would always be covered with a layer of sweating moisture, and I would wonder where it came from as I poured myself a glass and stood drinking while father worked down in the basement, the main area of which lay directly beneath the kitchen floor. "I can hear you walking around up here," he said to me once, peering out from the half-open door with a pale, sweaty face, the front of his shirt dampened with a dark layer of moisture as he wiped the gold frames of his little round spectacles with it. "I don't want you doing that. It distracts my work. Why don't you go play with your friends?" "I don't have any," I told him. "They all make fun of me." "Can't I come down and watch you work?" He replaced his glasses, and at once his eyes disappeared beneath twin ovals of reflected light, and he was silent a moment as he stood regarding me. "Never come down here," he said. His voice was soft and quiet, barely audible above the roaring cooler which filled the house with a sound like air makes when you put a hollow seashell against your ear. "Like the ocean. It's dangerous down here," he said. "You could be killed." Father took me out to the desert once so that he could teach me how to survive in the heat. The problem, he said, with children my age is that they always turn up missing because someone drags them away to die out there. Then he laughed when he saw the expression on my face. We went out beyond the highway in his station wagon where the flat yellow land becomes littered with occasional dump sites. People would drag broken furniture out there, mattresses bursting with loose stuffing, cracked porcelain sinks rusting in the heat, piles of surplus brick and wood, and huge steel frames supporting miles of electrical cable would continue on until I thought they must go across the desert forever. Sometimes, while the dry wind stirred the sage bushes, the sound of a shotgun would snap into the air and then rise, echoing over the jagged brown mountains until the desert finally swallowed it up. I would sit on the back of the tailgate while Father would dig a hole into the earth and line it with stones for a fire while the evening drew charcoal shadows over the ground and made the mountains into ominous dark giants as the smell of wood smoke would drift on the air from the rising orange fire. One night before the last of the light had stolen from the day, I found a dead rabbit. "He's dead, isn't he, Daddy?" Father prodded the black fly-swollen corpse with his shoe, then squatted down over it a moment, concealing it from view, and I could see the muscles in his shoulders bunching as he did something to it. "Maybe you better look again here," he said, rising and standing to the side so that I could see in the dying orange light as it began to twitch and then shake its head a little, as though waking from sleep. In a few minutes it was off, its brown fur blending in with the desert as the night fell. The summer went on. In the mornings the sun rose in the lavender silence like a giant orange. In the evenings it slipped behind the trees at the edge of the sky like a magnificent apple. One evening the tall men came to visit Father. They wore long black suits with red ties, and they sat at the kitchen table, two of them, beneath the pale glow of the ceiling lamp, and they smoked cigarettes while they talked with Father, manila sheets spilling from their coffee-colored briefcases over the smooth formica surface. I watched them from the living room, where Mother and I sat before the blue television screen, peering at them through the haze of cigarette smoke, colored yellow by the soft lamp like fading photographs. They began raising their voices at Father, and he raised his back, louder. Printed on the shiny surface of one of their briefcases was a golden eagle bearing a leaf in one of its talons and arrows in the other, and I wanted to touch it, run my fingers over it to see if it felt as beautiful as it looked. I crept into the kitchen just as Father was rising above them, his face a round, sweating moon as he pointed at the locked door of the basement. "You'll never go down there," he was saying, "ever. I defy you to rain down on me any plague you can think of, but you'll never see what's down there." Then he stopped because he had noticed me watching him, locked into immobility at the sight of his rage, and then the tall men turned and saw me too. I could hear him breathing heavily as he crossed the kitchen in silence and stood over me, looking down a moment through the flat gold circles where I knew his eyes must be. Then he raised his hand to unlatch the kitchen door, and I saw that his hand was shaking, and he closed the door in front of me as I stood listening to the angry voices which resumed a moment later. At night sometimes the walls became so hot that when you touched them they felt moist, like soft skin, and in places the paint would come away in damp flakes so that the walls were marked with huge round ovals where they had sunken in beneath the heat. Father would come home late at night, the smell of alcohol filling the house with him, and I would listen to him tripping over furniture as he made his way to the living room, and he would pause sometimes in the hallway, and I could hear him breathing as he studied the crumbling walls, and I would know that he would be looking at the dead spots, running his palm over them with a dry, calloused sound, as though contemplating their nature. Then one night he came into my bedroom after repeating this ritual and turned on the light. My eyes burned with white as he stood talking. "Have you seen those spots?" he said. "We must be infected. I've let it spread. We have to get you out before it comes in here." He stood a moment, blinking with slow, dull eyes rimmed in pink, and looked as if he might go to sleep standing right there. "I've let it happen," he said. "Now we're infected. It's my fault." He lingered a bit longer, swaying, eyes unfocused, then shut out the light and went away. 13 years getting degrees so I can invent better ways of killing people. I heard him say this to my mother one night as the rain fell in heavy sheets over the roof, and I lay in my bed with the covers thrown off, gazing up at the cracked, yellowing ceiling and wondered what it meant. Then I heard my mother say something even stranger. "Put that away. You'd only hurt us more." Then the monsoons came, and the sun would disappear behind a screen of floating, oily clouds, a dull white disk, powerless and slumbering as water ran in glossy black streams over the pavement, and lightning burst like snapshots beyond the stacked gray clouds lined up over the rusty copper desert. The air would grow heavy and come in through the open windows with the smell of ozone, passing moist and cool through the rapidly darkening house, while Father sat morosely on the couch in front of the empty blue slate of the television screen, his hands supporting his pale, heavy head, and I would sit watching him, wondering why he had become so quiet. Eventually I made up a song and sang it to myself while the rain came down. "Rain falls, sun sleeps, sky darkens, Father's weak." But soon the pavements would dry, the mud becoming cracked earth, and the sun would rise in a hot and copper sky like the angry head of God. Then came the evening near the end of summer, when Father stood over us in the living room while the machine hum of cicadas rose in the night through the open window behind him, his watery eyes like livid suns behind the gleam of his spectacles, white skin leaking wetly as the lamplight carved his mighty shadow into the wall behind him. In one of his hands was a clear glass of gold liquid, while the other swept abruptly through the air in a gesture meant to include the entire living room. "All this," he said, "must be taken outside and destroyed." "It has become infected. A virus has contaminated it from the basement, and we must either do this or die." Then he turned to regard me, and my hand twitched as though with its own life, and I was unable to look at him. "Sarah," he said, "go to the garage and bring me the axe." I lay in Mother's lap in a corner of the bare living room as she combed through my hair with her damp fingers, and we could hear him in the backyard tearing apart the furniture as the heat lifted the paint from the walls and made our hair limp, while the night gave birth to a dry wind that rushed through the house in a sudden hot sweep. Soon he stopped, and we listened. Wind chimes gave a silver midnight chorus in the silence, in the heavy stillness, and the air ceased its restless passage, grown empty and wearied, unmoving, dead. Winter. During the long wet days when the streets would fill with muddy rivers of rainwater and the windows would fog up with chilly gray air, I would sit and watch the silver liquid pools coalesce and change protean shapes over the glass, while the bare black limbs of crooked trees would stir against a sky the color of rust beyond them. Sometimes I would warm my stiffened hands by pressing them to the cooling sides of the oven and the bright lemony scent of the meringue pies. I would watch through the glass as loaves of bread rose warm and yellow beneath the tiny white bulb of the oven light. She would take hot meals in to Father, who would spend the long days in bed with the door closed, and I would see him sitting there as I peeked in, a pale white form like a porcelain statue, sitting at the edge of the bed, hair uncombed and shiny with oil, his face looking bare without his glasses, the curtains pulled shut. Mother would sit and read to me stories from the Bible in the afternoons, stories which seemed vivid and terrifying. Cain branded and exiled from his home, Jesus raising Lazarus from his dark cave, God's covenant with man after the flood in the form of a shining rainbow spread over the sky. Sometimes I would go to the window and look for the rainbow that would tell me that God wasn't angry with me anymore, but I never found it. Mother and I spent an afternoon gathering the dead things from the yard left behind in the passage of the floods, bleached palm fronds, dried things that had once been oranges, wads of sodden newspaper that left your hands black with ink, and in the backyard the splintered pieces of wood remaining from what Father had destroyed, which came apart in our hands as we stuffed it into trash bags. The earth was soft and wet beneath my toes as I waded out into the flooded front yard with my jeans rolled up over my knees, my passage causing the dirty gray water to come alive with hordes of green and black dragonflies as I stepped over fallen tree branches and the swollen carcasses of birds swarming with red ants. We sprayed the mud from the driveway with a hose, and I watched as the worms dredged up from the earth struggled against the force of the water as they were washed back into the dead brown yard. And when I asked Mother why so many of them had died, she said it was because they had drowned beneath too much rain and not enough earth. I would search the sky for the sun, and occasionally I would find it, a dull, weak coin hanging restless and dry, waiting. Rain falls, flood streets, a little secret Mother keeps. She said that I was never to leave the front yard when it was raining, or else I might be swept up by the currents and washed away like the worms. One day while she was watering the plants in the house, I crossed the mud-blackened street and went into the orchard to see if the tree we had stolen from had any fruit left on it. My feet sunk to the ankles in soft red earth, and the mud felt cool against my skin as I walked among the aisles of dried white trees, gone a soft peach color from the incessant rain, and soon I could hardly see the distant brown facade of our house swallowed by ranks of rotten trees behind me. The orchard was silent, and when I paused I could hear the sound of flowing water somewhere, and I turned to see a withered bird rise from a dripping branch and sail off into the yellow sky like a ragged kite. Soon I found the tree near the middle, isolated as though purposely separated from the other trees around it. Shriveled brown lumps dangled from branches, and I took one of them and returned home with it in the pocket of my dress. When Mother discovered that I had disobeyed her and ruined my dress, she hit me with a wooden spoon until I screamed for her to stop, while bruises appeared on my arms and legs like discolored roses. She said that I was never to leave the house again. Father came to see me only once during the winter. On a bright, rainless day, as I was sitting at my desk making drawings with colored pencils, soft pink and yellow and peach pastels, while the draining gutters flowed outside with oily water that became a lemony white in the gentle sunlight falling through my open window. The pictures I drew were of an angry red sun above a tiny house surrounded by an old gray wall of bleached stones, and as I was looking them over in the mild hazel air, I became aware of him watching me through the doorway, his eyes a clear, sober gray like rainwater, holding something between his hands, which, after a silent moment between us, he placed on my desk and stood back, hands in his pockets. "I brought this for you," he said, lingering awkwardly a moment, then retreating away down the hall. What he had given me was a small glass unicorn, about the size of a paperweight, fashioned of smooth, transparent crystal so clear that, when I held it up to the sun, tiny rainbows burst inside. I watched Mother cut the stems from a cluster of fresh black roses with yellow edges, then placed the bunch into a glass pitcher filled with water. I asked her why there were no roses in winter, and she said that it was because everything died sooner or later, and then I saw that her hands were trembling in the gold sunlight coming through the kitchen window, and I noticed that her face had become whiter than usual, like a dirty gray moon with hollow black spots, so I stopped asking her questions. Then one day she didn't come out of her room at all. Father began cooking meals and taking them in to her, and I watched him prepare them for her every night as he moved about the kitchen beneath the dry white fluorescent, which made his face resemble an eyeless mask over which swarmed the shadows of black moths, which threw themselves against the light until they lay spent and dying on the linoleum countertop. I listened one night to him talking in her room as I stood out of view of the open doorway, and the soft hissing of the gentle rain poured steadily beyond him. "You've been down there, haven't you?" he said, and it scared me that I could hear his words trembling a little because I had never believed he could be afraid of anything. "You know what's down there. My God," he said, "all those chemicals. I told you never to clean in there." And it was then, while the squirming rectangle of pale rain moved over the floor at my feet, that I thought of the basement doorknob and how recently shiny it had seemed to me. I thought of all the cities in the Bible that were destroyed by God because they disobeyed their covenant, and I understood then that we were being punished by him for something that we had done. "Make her better," I told Father, and he sat watching me from his chair with sorrowful gray eyes. "Make her like the rabbit, and I promise never to steal oranges again." He looked at me in the weakening light as though he had never known me, his tired, sightless eyes resting clearly now behind his glasses. "Oranges?" he said. And when I waited for something more, a recognition of some kind, anything, he merely turned away and sat watching the dying evening light draw blood from the land like a syringe, until it was white and motionless and made no sound at all. At night I asked God to make her well again, promising him, as I had promised Father, that I would never again disobey him. But the morning came when I arose in the cold ivory dawn to a silent house, and when I peered in Mother's bedroom, there was only a wrinkled bed imprinted with the shape of a recent figure, and the pale curtains fanning like cretonne wings in an icy wind. Father remained in his chair in the living room, a mute, slackened figure with dirty gray skin and yellow, unmoving eyes, peering beyond the parted drapes to the whitening morning outside. The smell of alcohol rose from him in a powerful wave as the chill draft picked it up, gently stirring the curtains. The shadows of bare trees striped over him so that he resembled a cracked figurine. I said nothing to him, merely stood in the unbearable silence, waiting, and after a time he turned to regard me, his flesh peeling from the vinyl as he moved, with the sound an eggshell makes as it is stripped from the tender white skin beneath. I looked at him, remaining mute as the moist air moved over us, because I knew that he had let the tall men take her away, knew that he had not been strong enough to resist them, and he saw that I knew, and looked away, drinking gold liquid from a crystal glass. I buried my orange a short time later in a soft red spot of earth in the front yard, directly across from the orchard, remembering what Mother had told me. I packed the swollen earth with my palms, flattening it until there was only a bald oval in the brown grass, then sat listening to the awakening morning, the steady dripping of water into an empty pail somewhere, the rising roar of traffic out in the city, the bark of an agitated dog. I watched the spreading gold light as it painted the wet ground and shifted the shadows to fresh positions. The earth was cold beneath my knees, but I was unable to move for a time. Father's face appeared in the window eventually, looking with curiosity out at me sitting on the front lawn, and I stared at him until he went away. Then I stood beneath the rising giant of the sun, watching as it labored over the orchard in a bright scarlet path, and the cool air, which it could no longer warm, wrapped me in its gray shroud, and I wondered what it was I had ever been afraid of. All right, and so that's my first short story and ground zero also for my recent trilogy, the Motorcycle Girls trilogy. I've based it on this and expanded it. So those are available on Amazon. Every Angel is Terrifying is Volume 1. The Motorcycle Girl Descends into Hell is Volume 2, and I'm working on the third volume, There Is No Place That Does Not See You. All right, so let's finish up here. At a dinner party one night, I finally had a permanent falling out with my friend. We got into a dispute over the nature of myth. I knew very well by this point exactly what I was talking about and that he didn't. He hadn't read anywhere near as much about mythology as I had, and pretty soon we were trading insults. Our agon was over. My world was rapidly and sharply diverging from his, and so we had a parting just shortly after graduating from college. He later ditched his literary career to become a Hollywood screenwriter. Now, to rewind back a bit to my last year of college, at one point I began to feel a sharp, stinging pain on the right side of my abdomen. I started feeling nauseated and sick, and so I called up my mother to take me to the emergency room. There they x-rayed me and declared that I only had stomach flu. They gave me some pills, and I returned back to my apartment on Lemon Street, but over the next few days the pain worsened. Pretty soon I was in agony, crawling around the floor of my apartment. I had diarrhea, and I couldn't find a comfortable position to lie in. So I called my mother again and said, "Mom, I don't think this is stomach flu. Something else is wrong." So once again, Mom showed up, and this time took me to her health care program people. There the doctor felt my side, and I could tell by the look on his face that something serious was going on, but he didn't say anything. He just told me that I needed to be taken to a larger hospital up the street where they would check me out. What was happening was that my appendix had already burst. The doctor didn't want to tell me that I was on the verge of death so as not to panic me, and the physicians in the ER didn't tell me what was wrong either. They only told me that I needed to be prepped for surgery in a couple of hours. They shot me up with some drug or other, and I lay there for 2 hours wondering what was going on. I was thirsty, but they told me I could only have ice chips. Then they wheeled me into the surgery room, where they were listening to pop music. Everyone was very genial and happy. I could almost imagine them wheeling around the surgery unit on roller skates. I remember the guy putting the anesthesia mask on me and telling me to count backwards. And then everything went suddenly very dark. Dying must be a similar experience. What they had to do was cut my entire abdomen open and take out all my intestines to vacuum the poison off of them. My appendix had exploded, but I hadn't died because the poison had actually been walled off to a narrow pocket. But they had to vacuum my intestines just in case, and they packed them back in and left the wound open. They didn't stitch it up because they wanted it to drain properly. In a way, this was like a shamanic experience. Shamans during their initiations report having visions of their internal anatomies being taken apart by the ancestors and then put back in with special powers that are now internalized within the shaman's body. I was wheeled back into my hospital room, and my brother later said that he saw me and that I was so pale he thought I was dead. I had an incredibly high fever, something like 105 degrees, and it took a long time for me to come back into my body. I remember how nightmarish it was waking up from anesthesia because you don't come back all at once, but in bits and pieces, like trying to tune into a radio station that you just can't quite get hold of. The worst part was when they had to come in and wake me up every night at 3 a.m. to dress my wound. Even though they gave me morphine, when they took the dressing off, my wound was so terribly sensitive and tender that it was almost unbearable. But I did recover. I was in the hospital for about a week, and then one day out of nowhere, my father came to visit me. I had been estranged from him ever since I was 16 years old. He had called me to the phone once, and he overheard me telling my brother that I didn't want to talk to him. When I got on the phone, he was really vicious with me, and so I simply hung up. That was that, as far as I was concerned. I had no intention of ever speaking to the son of a bitch again. But he showed up to visit me, and he was genial and funny as usual. He was making me laugh, and it hurt my side to laugh. More sadism, I suppose. Some people never change. That was the last time for many years that I ever talked to him, though. My brother stayed in contact with him for the next decade, however, and would periodically give me reports of my father's deteriorating mental condition. After his mother and father had died, his mother left him quite a bit of money, maybe $100,000 or so. But his brother, the Scottsdale cop, was supposed to control the payments and give them to him a bit at a time so that it would last many years. His brother, however, made the mistake of giving my father access to all the money at once. And pretty soon my father was driving all over the city doing weird, erratic things. He had 2 or 3 separate apartments, for what reasons, who knows, located in different parts of the city. And my brother said that he had the habit of staying in motel rooms in Scottsdale quite a bit. Scottsdale is where all the prostitutes are, since that is where all the visiting businessmen like to reside. My brother also informed me that he was becoming increasingly paranoid. He was driving through traffic thinking that other cars were following him around. One day my brother said that he showed up at his apartment insisting that my brother go and get his video camera so that he could use it to film some of the people who were following him. My brother closed his front door while my father apparently waited outside for him to get the camera. But when he came back, my father had mysteriously vanished. He had just abruptly gotten back into his car and left. That was it for my brother's relationship to my father. He never wanted to see him again after that. My brother and I surmised that he had gambled the money away and spent it on prostitutes. I'm not exactly sure what he did with it, but that sounds like a likely scenario to me. Before too long, he had spent everything and wound up homeless, sleeping on park benches at Scottsdale. Eventually, his brother took him in and lived with him. His brother had burned his way through 3 marriages and was now living alone. Meanwhile, college was over, so I returned to live with my mother for a couple of years. For the first year of living at home with her, I wasn't sure what to do with myself, so all I did was concentrate on reading Campbell and his influences all day long, every day. I went back through his books. I read Finnegan's Wake twice. I reread Spengler. Then I read through all the volumes of Carl Jung in the Bullinger series. I read through the novels of Thomas Mann and all the poetry of Robinson Jeffers. These were Campbell's favorites, and I figured that if he'd read them, then they were okay for me to read as well. I would sit out in the backyard of the house my mother was renting in Central Mesa under a tree, reading and staring at the sky and the palm trees and the birds hopping from branch to branch. There's the Masks of God and the 4 volumes of the collected poetry of the very great and very much neglected California poet Robinson Jeffers, who mostly wrote in the 20s and 30s and 40s. And I read through all of those volumes, and the great thing about them is Jeffers is concerned with myth. He's very well grounded in mythology, which is why both Campbell and I like his work. And someday I'm going to go back through him and reread him again. One of my all-time favorite poets, up there with Rilke. And there's the novels of Thomas Mann. Buddenbrooks was the first one, then The Magic Mountain, and then the magnificent Joseph and His Brothers tetralogy. Dr. Faustus isn't as good. It's a flawed novel. It's nowhere on the league of the other 3, but it is worth a read. But then after about a year of that, my mom told me I had to get a job. She had finally sobered up, and now she wanted to go to college too and get a degree to become a substance abuse counselor. It wasn't easy for her to go into recovery. She'd had to go through several treatment programs before it finally clicked for her, and she realized she was never going to drink again. She wrote out her autobiography for one of her classes, which she allowed me to read through, and I found it very illuminating. But now I had to find a job. At first I tried to work at Bank of America in their corporate office in downtown Phoenix. I had to wear a tie, which I hated, and slacks and nice shoes, and sit in the cubicles, stamping papers and entering random data into a random computer. I did that for about 2 weeks and then realized I had entered into one of Kafka's novels and just simply walked off the job one afternoon during lunch hour. I had already gotten a job offer, however, to work at ASU in their administrative department as a courier. My job, which was a full-time 9-to-5 job, was to cart stacks and boxes of stacks of data all around the campus, riding in my golf cart. It was perfect for me, a real Hermes Mercury job. On my deliveries, I was always sneaking into the library and taking out stacks of books, which I would then transfer to my car in the parking lot. Sometimes the deliveries would take longer than expected, and they were always asking questions, but somehow I managed to evade detection. I did that job for about 1.5 years. I lived with Mom for 1 more year, paying her rent for her so that she could use her money to pay for her college classes. But living with my mother, I very soon became depressed, bored, and lonely. Yet again, I had lost all my friends at once, and I had resumed drinking beer. I remember one Friday night after getting paid from ASU, sitting on a wooden bench on her front porch, drinking and feeling sorry for myself. "Fuck it," I muttered. "It's time to get laid." So I drove over to the Travelodge Motel around the corner and checked into a room for the night. Then I found a singles newspaper and sat in the motel room perusing the ads until I found an escort agency that looked plausible. Hesitantly, I called them and a guy answered. I told him where I was and asked if he could send a girl out to me. "No problem," he said. "She'll be right over." I sat nervously drinking my beer until about a half hour later a knock came at the door. I went to open it to see a very attractive, fortunately, prostitute with her driver standing behind her. I was a little surprised and confused that the driver wanted to come into the room as well. Suddenly I got very nervous. He said that he only wanted to see that I had the money to pay for her. "How do I know you're not going to rob me?" I said. "No, sir," he said very politely. "We don't do that. It's just a formality. This is how it works." Nervously, I opened my wallet and showed him that I had the money. He nodded. "Fine," he said, and then left. The prostitute told me to strip down, which I did, and she took all her clothes off as well. She was Latina, very shapely, slightly plump, but I liked that. She immediately slid a condom onto me and started sucking until I grew very hard. Then she lay back on the bed and spread her legs as I entered a woman for the first time in my life and came very quickly. Wow, I thought to myself, this is really fun. I've been missing out. She then got dressed and I gave her the money and she left. I spent the rest of the night in the motel drinking beer and suddenly feeling very good about myself. It was time to get out of Mom's house.